I'm assuming that if you're here today that you support changing the cannabis laws. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the benefits of cannabis medicinally and how it's a great therapeutic benefit for a lot of ailments. And I'm not going to talk a lot about hemp and how hemp can help the environment and the industrial and environmental benefits of grow more cannabis hemp. And I'm not even really going to talk about the harms of prohibition so much and the incredible damage it does to individuals and families and the financial and social toll that prohibition of cannabis does. What I want to talk about is the effort to change the law and how I think we can change the laws to decriminalize and then legalize cannabis right here in British Columbia over the next few years. And so my name is Dana Larson, and I've been working at this for pretty much all of my adult life. As a student at university, I started a club called the League for Ethical Action on Drugs, and we put on events on campus and had speakers come. And this was in the early 90s, the time when hemp was so rare and not very widely available. I'll just let these folks in. Accessible BC? Yeah, sorry, we just closed the door because they were having a dance party over there. I guess they'd quiet it down a little bit. You haven't missed anything. So yeah, at that time, I remember we had a speaker come over, a friend of mine, Chris Bennett, who I just met at the time. He had a little square of hemp fabric and little bits of hemp paper, and we'd all pass it around, this stuff that we'd never seen before. And when I graduated from university, I went to work for Mark Emery, the Prince of Pot, and he's now in a prison in Yazoo, Mississippi for selling cannabis seeds through the mail to Americans. Or really, he's in jail for funding the marijuana movement for many years and putting many millions of dollars into the effort to legalize revenue that he made from his seed business. And during that time, I worked at Cannabis Culture magazine, where I had a chance to learn a lot about the cannabis plant and the politics and history and culture around it. In 2000 and 2001, I helped form the Canadian Marijuana Party and then the BC Marijuana Party. A couple of years later, I joined the NDP and I created a group called End to Prohibition that works within the NDP to develop better drug policies and policies around cannabis. And I opened the Vancouver Seed Bank, and then a couple of years later, in 2008, I opened the Vancouver Medicinal Cannabis Dispensary. We now serve 4,000 patients in the Lower Mainland and actually all across Canada by mail order as well. And now I'm on tour with the Sensible BC campaign. And in all this time of doing all this effort, people have often said to me, you know, what are you getting so worked up about? It's just a matter of time till these things are going to change. It's inevitable that marijuana is going to be legalized, so there's no need to really get worked up about it. It's going to happen no matter what. And that, to my mind, is the totally wrong attitude and is not how things get done. There's no reason these laws could not perpetuate for another several decades or another generation. And in fact, I feel that in many ways right now we're in a similar place to where we were in the late 1970s. Late 1970s, there was head shops, there was cannabis culture information was widely available. In Canada, we had Pierre Trudeau and Joe Clark, the two prime ministers at that time, both saying it was time to change the marijuana laws. The US, we had Jimmy Carter, president, saying it was time to change the cannabis laws. Many American states were having referendums to decriminalize cannabis possession and make it just a fine instead of a serious criminal penalty. And yet a whole generation has gone by. And these laws haven't gotten any better. In fact, they've gotten a lot worse. And there's no reason why that couldn't happen again. But at the same time, we have had many victories over the last 20 years or so. Since I got involved in this, I've seen a lot of these things happen and helped some of them happen. For instance, cannabis hemp is now being grown legally in Canada. That was legalized in 1996 by the Liberal government. And so for the first time in many decades, we're growing a lot of cannabis hemp in Canada now. And although it's still too tightly restricted and there's still too much red tape and there's still some problems with it, nevertheless, that's a big step forward. And you know, also in Canada now we have ready access to bongs and pipes, which are really harm reduction devices. You don't have to get an old Coke can and punch some holes in it to smoke some cannabis anymore. You can get a nice, clean, pure medicinal glass pipe or a nice bong or whatever, a water device, or even amazing vaporizers. And there's some incredible vaporizers on the market now as well. And although these things are actually still illegal in Canada, all those things are still against the law under Section 462.2 of the Criminal Code, but that law is rarely enforced. The bigger of a city you're in, the less likely it's going to be enforced. The smaller of a town and the further north you go in Canada, the more likely you're going to have problems with that. Same with cannabis seeds. Those laws are still in the book. Selling marijuana seeds is still illegal And of course, Mark Emery's in prison for exporting marijuana seeds to the US, but there's quite a few places across Canada now that sell seeds, and pretty much anybody in Canada can get good marijuana seeds by mail order, so they have access to a broad range of strains, and especially when you're growing for medicinal use, being able to find the right strain for your needs is very important. So a lot of Canadians have access to that now, but that law is still on the books. And medicinal marijuana is also very widely available in Canada now. The government's growing marijuana, which, although it's low quality swag, they've really made an effort to kind of wreck that cannabis by forcing them to mix in stock and shred it up to reduce the potency. Nevertheless, they're growing cannabis, and that's still a step forward in a good way. And even better than that, there's tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Canadians that now get access to medical cannabis through a dispensary. Either one in their hometown or by mail order, and those are expanding quite rapidly across the country right now as well. But when we look at these things, for the most part, aside from the hemp cultivation, the laws have not changed, and in fact the laws have gotten worse. And for the successes we've had have mostly been in civil disobedience and in ignoring the laws more and getting them to be ignored by the police rather than actually getting them changed. And in fact, at the same time that Washington and Colorado had their amazing success in having their referendums to legalize marijuana, the very same day in Canada, Stephen Harper's mandatory minimums came into play. Those laws were finally put into force, and so cultivation of just 6 plants in Canada will now get you 6 months in prison as a minimum sentence, and growing larger number of plants, you'll see much longer sentences. In fact, that 6 months becomes 9 months if you're growing in a rented home, if you have children in your house, or if they consider it to be a public safety hazard. And as far as I've seen, every single grow up they've ever found is considered a public safety hazard, no matter what it looks like. So, and these penalties are quite severe, and there's also strong penalties for selling over 3 kilos of cannabis, trafficking over 3 kilos. Well, I fall under that mandatory minimum. I run a medical marijuana dispensary. We have far more than 3 kilos on the premises, so myself and all my staff could have a year in prison, or a year and a half actually, because we rent the store that we do our business from. Even though we've been operating openly for many years, we would still fall under those mandatory minimums. And so when I look ahead to how we're going to change the laws and how we're going to have the success, I look to the American states, Washington and Colorado, and the many other American states over the past few decades that have changed the laws, and in every single instance when they've allowed medical marijuana, but I should add that at the same time Washington and Colorado did their thing, Massachusetts became the 18th state to legalize medical marijuana access. And that's an average of more than 1 a year since 1996, when California became the first state to allow medical marijuana through a referendum. And in all these instances, it's always been a referendum. It's never been a state government or a federal government, at least in North America, that's been the one making it top down. It's always come from the grassroots. And in fact, in those American states, every single time the governors have campaigned against this legislation and then been put into the role of having to enforce it and put it into place when they were originally saying they didn't want to have it happen in the first place. And so we happen to live in the province of British Columbia, which is the only province in Canada that has a referendum system also. And it's actually harder to get something on the ballot here than it is in any American state, but it can be done, and I'm going to get back to that in a minute. But what I want to say is that we worked to try to figure out what we could do as a province to change these laws, what British Columbia could do. So we got together with a lawyer named Kirk Tusaw, and Kirk's a brilliant lawyer. He's won us many victories in court in terms of expanding medical cannabis access and also curbing some of the excesses of Harper's war on drugs. And Kirk and I did a lot of research, and we figured out a way to decriminalize cannabis possession in British Columbia and to get us on the path to legalization. And the law we wrote is called the Sensible Policing Act. And the Sensible Policing Act is 2 main parts to it. The first part is to decriminalize cannabis possession in British Columbia. People say, how can you do that when these are federal laws? You can't change the federal law as a province, and that's entirely true, you can't. And we can't have a referendum on something if it's unconstitutional. The law's got to be a valid law within the jurisdiction of the province and all that kind of stuff. But provinces have jurisdiction over policing and over administration of justice. Every province and every provincial attorney general has the duty and the responsibility to tell the police in that province where to set their priorities, where to focus their resources, and where not to focus their resources, and what's not to be considered so important. And that's not like a technicality, that is the role of the Attorney General of every province. All the police in British Columbia, including the RCMP, are provincial police officers, and they act under the authority of the Police Act, which is an act of the British Columbia Legislature. So what our legislation does, the Sensible Policing Act, is it amends the Police Act. And it tells all the police in British Columbia to spend no time and no resources on searching or seizing or detaining or arresting anybody for possession of cannabis. Now, if you're a minor under the age of 19, we thought, well, there should be something in there to deal with that. We don't want minors going to prison and getting a criminal record either. That's more harmful for the most part than even the worst case scenario of using cannabis. Having a lifetime criminal record can be quite harmful. But we wanted some kind of control there. We thought that would be appropriate. So we decided to deal with cannabis and minors in exactly the same way as alcohol. The legislation specifies that a minor in possession of cannabis can be treated the same as, but no more severely than a minor with alcohol. So a police officer could seize that cannabis, could potentially write them a ticket, but there'd be no handcuffing, arresting, no criminal record, none of those other kinds of things involved. And of course, a minor with a medical exemption would be treated the same as anybody else and would be allowed to possess their cannabis if they fell under the legal medical system. So that's the first part of this legislation. And I'll say that we actually have a precedent for this idea quite recently, where the provinces were taking control and telling the police what to do in defiance of a federal law. We had the long gun registry quite recently, and in 2003, British Columbia joined 7 other provinces in saying that we're not going to enforce this law. The Attorney General and all the Attorney Generals in 8 provinces across Canada, they said the long gun registry is costing too much money, it's going to criminalize otherwise law-abiding citizens, no one's following it anyways, no one's going along with this law, we refuse to enforce it. We're telling our police not to bother. Well, they can do that for the long gun registry, for someone who's in possession of an unregistered long gun. They can do the same thing for someone in possession of cannabis. It's a very, very similar situation. And we have another precedent recently of the province standing up to the federal government in an area of drug policy, and that is the supervised injection site in Vancouver, where the federal government said this is our jurisdiction, we want to shut that place down, we don't care that it's saving lives and that every study shows it's benefiting the community, we don't like it, we want to shut it down. The province went to court, they fought, and they won. Insight is still there and the long gun registry is gone. And however you feel about those things, those are examples of the province being able to stand up to the federal government, and in both cases the province has ultimately won those battles. So we can do the same thing here with cannabis in British Columbia. Now we want to go further than just telling the police to lay off cannabis users. That's a good first step. It acknowledges that we recognize that the war on cannabis is failing, and we're taking cannabis users off the front lines of the war on drugs. We're letting our police focus their resources on more substantive crimes. But we want to go further than that. We want to have a legally regulated system in BC where people can grow their own cannabis in some kind of limited quantities, where they can buy it legally, buy cannabis products and extracts that are labeled and clear and what they are, and produced in a safe and responsible manner. So the second part of this legislation, it mandates that the Attorney General of the province demand the federal government change the law. He has to write a letter within a certain amount of time calling on the federal government to change the cannabis laws, to either take cannabis out of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act entirely, or to give BC an exemption, which they can do under Section 56. They're allowed to give any person or class of persons an exemption, so they could let us do an experiment in BC and say we're going to let you try something different and see how it goes, or make whatever legislative change necessary so that British Columbia can go further as a province. And then along with that, it sets up a provincial commission. So we have a study, a group of people who get together, go around the province, talk to experts, talk to citizens, figure out what the rules and regulations for legal cannabis could be, because those are provincial jurisdiction. When cannabis is legalized, it's very similar to alcohol and tobacco. There's some federal laws around importing and exporting and labeling, but for the most part, alcohol and tobacco are provincial jurisdiction, and provinces have the right to set age limits and point of sale and hours of sale and tax rates, and all those things are done provincially for the most part. So we want this commission to figure out, have public hearings, talk to everybody, come to some kind of consensus as to what the rules and regulations around legal marijuana are going to be. And we don't set up what that's going to be in advance, but I know that the model I'll be pushing for is similar to the wine model, like I kind of mentioned earlier. If you want to make wine in your own home, you can do that. There's no big red tape around. There's a limit to how much you can make, and there's a limit that you can't sell it, but if you want to share it with your friends, if you want to do it yourself, you can make more than enough wine to satisfy your own needs. Anybody can set up a winery. There's no limit. There's not like a certain number of wineries. The government doesn't brew wine, nor should the government be growing marijuana themselves. That would be silly. But to compete as a winery, there's got to be a market, you've got to follow the rules. If you say your wine's organic, it's got to be organic, you've got to produce it safely and responsibly. And if I'm buying a cannabis product at the store, I want to know how it's grown, I want a label on it, the potency. If it's going to extract in some form, I want a label telling me what the perceived effects are going to be and how to use it safely and all that kind of stuff, right? And we need to make allowances for medical use and figure out how we're going to deal with medical users in terms of taxation and access and those things, and figure all those rules out. We can do all that. And so we got this great law. It would do all these wonderful things. It would decriminalize possession. It would move us on the path of legalization in our province. It would be very symbolically important and practically important. And one thing I'll add is that people sometimes say, isn't cannabis already decriminalized in BC? Like, I was smoking a joint, the cop just told me to put it out, and he didn't charge me or anything. And especially if you're in Vancouver, that's very true. In Vancouver, they lay less than 10 possession charges for cannabis every year. They have a stated policy that they do not want to bust anybody for possession of cannabis. For the most part, they will ignore it entirely, or they'll ask you to put it out if they think you're in a public place and it might be bothering somebody. But they've made a concerted effort, and that's been fairly recently, over the last several years, that they've made this policy. In the rest of British Columbia, possession charges are skyrocketing. In 2005, there was 1,700 British Columbians charged for cannabis possession. That was actually at a low. It had been slowly but steadily going down. And at that time, the Liberal government federally was talking about decriminalization, and it was kind of in the air. So the numbers was the numbers are slowly heading downwards. But they were around that range. They hadn't gone over 2,000 people a year for quite a few years before that. 2006, when Harper came into power, the possession charges jumped. Every year since then, they've gone up substantially. By 2010, they had more than doubled, and last year there was 3,700 possession charges, more than double of 2005. Over 10 people a day who were charged for possession. There's also about 20,000 incidences where the police file a report about taking someone's cannabis away in some form. That's a 30% increase over that same time period. There has not been a 30% increase in marijuana users. There has not been a doubling in cannabis users. This is not a response to just more people using it. It's clearly the RCMP making an effort to charge more people. And they really shouldn't be doing that. They should in fact be responding to the provincial government and what people at BC want. People at BC do not want to be spending double our budget now over this time period on busting pot smokers. And it's very expensive to charge somebody. We've actually got a study going on right now that'll be completed soon with the criminologists at Simon Fraser University to figure out who are these 3,700 people each year and what happens to them. Do they get convicted, and what's it costing us to enforce these laws, and where's this all going? And I'll say that even if you're not convicted, just being charged for possession can be quite harmful. Just being charged for possession and having the charges dropped can result in not being able to cross the US border. We're very open in sharing information with our American cousins when it comes to Canadians and what our activities have been. So it can be quite harmful in that way. And it's also quite traumatizing as well to be put in prison, often strip searched, held in a cell for quite a long time, being handcuffed in front of your friends and family. All of these things cause other problems and are harmful in themselves, even if you don't get a criminal record in the end. But anyway, so we've got this law that will make all these changes. It would take that number down from 3,700 charges a year to pretty much zero. It would take that 20,000 number down to pretty much zero. And it would save us a lot of money and be a lot of benefit to British Columbians. But how do we get this law passed? What do we do? Hey, thanks for coming. Just grab a seat. Well, Christy Clark could pass this law tomorrow if she wanted to. Nothing special about it that we have to have a referendum. And if the polls are right and the NDP forms government in the next election, Adrian Dix could also pass this law if he wanted to. There's nothing special about it. It would just take some political courage and some political will. Political courage and will that I feel is sadly lacking in both of our parties right now. We've had many MLAs, 4 Liberal MLAs, come out recently saying they want to decriminalize or legalize marijuana and calling for very similar proposals to what we're calling for. And in the NDP caucus, there's many MLAs also that want to change the laws. And one of them came and spoke at our event in Victoria. Nicholas Simons came and spoke to a crowd of 500 people there, along with everybody else, about the support for the changing of the laws. But the two leaders of the parties, for the most part, Christy Clark will just kind of laugh it off and say it's a federal issue. Adrian Dix will say, well, I support decriminalization, but it's a federal issue. So they're not willing to make it a provincial issue, like our province did when it came to the gun registry or when it came to Insight, when they said, no, this is a provincial issue because we're the ones paying for it. But anyways, let's assume that our provincial leaders are not going to pass this. Although we should certainly be pressuring our MLAs and working on them to get it through. Ultimately, I believe we can do this with a referendum. Now, like I said, it's difficult to get something on the ballot in British Columbia. It's actually harder in our province than any American state or any referendum system in the world that I know of. Ours is harder to get something on the ballot. And the testament to that is that there's only ever been one grassroots-driven referendum in our province. Of course, that was the campaign against the HST. Now, we actually have better polling for changing the cannabis laws than we did for getting rid of the HST in terms of support across the province. But what we lack, which the campaign against the HST had, is infrastructure. They had the unions on board. They had the NDP on board. They had a large part of the business community on board. They had a pretty broad coalition of people who know how to get out in the streets and how to get involved and organize people and make stuff happen. But we do have a lot of people who are very excited about changing these laws, and we're also building a coalition of our own. And we're having a lot of success as we go around the province, as we talk to people, getting things on board. The Vancouver Sun has endorsed us, Black Press has endorsed us with a series of editorials. We've got a lot of other organizers and people from all across the political spectrum that are coming on board and getting involved. But the thing about our referendum system is that nobody really knows how it works because no one's ever doesn't use it very often. But it's got fixed election dates. So the referendum system is entirely separate from the provincial elections. It's entirely its own thing. They're scheduled every 3 years in September. So the idea was that anything that people have got signatures on every 3 years, we'd all get together and have a vote on all the various issues. But because they made it so hard to get something on the ballot, those dates go by with nobody knowing that there was supposed to be a vote. So the next one is scheduled for September 2014. That's when the next referendum is scheduled. Regardless of whether we had all of our signatures at hand now or a year from now, the referendum will still be held in September 2014. To get something on the ballot in our province, we need to collect the signatures from 10% of the registered voters in every one of British Columbia's 85 electoral districts. That comes to roughly 400,000 people. And if you just get 9.9% in one electoral district, you fail. You've got to get 10% or more of the registered voters in every one of the 85 electoral districts. It's a very high threshold. It requires people working all over the province. You also only have 3 months to collect those signatures. You have 90 days from when you start that clock to stop that clock to collect all those signatures around the province. So even if people are out there, you gotta find them, identify them, get them on board, make sure they're a registered voter. It's a big process. So what we did is we took the Sensible Policing Act, we went to Elections BC, we submitted it, and we submitted an earlier draft, went back and forth a little bit till we worked out something that their lawyers agreed was jurisdictionally valid for our province. And they said, yeah, you can do this, let's have a referendum, let's have get the signatures. They gave us all the stuff and they started the clock. Then we said, okay, thanks, now we're withdrawing that because we're not actually gonna try to get signatures right now. But even just doing that, that means that Elections BC's lawyers have agreed, have agreed that this legislation is provincial jurisdiction. So now, even just with that, when Christy and Adrian say, oh, it's federal jurisdiction, no, you can do something. You can pass a Sensible Policing Act. We've got confirmation from your own government lawyers that this law is valid. You could decriminalize cannabis today. So that already gives us a strong legal argument to stand up with this. But it also gave us all the information, all the paperwork we need, so we have an advanced understanding of how this process all works with Elections BC. We're going to resubmit this legislation again at the end of August of this year. And for September, October, November of this year, we'll be doing the official signature gathering campaign. So between now and then, our goal is to pre-register people. When you sign up on this, when you sign up on our website, when you get your friends and family to sign on board, you go in our database. We're not sharing it with anybody else, but it lets us keep track of where our supporters are. And then when September comes, we can tell our volunteers, and hopefully a lot of you folks in this room will be volunteers, but we can tell our volunteers, here's the 100 people in your area that said they were going to sign. They're all expecting you to come over. We've already emailed and called them all. You just got to show up and get them to sign the official form for that area. Every single district has its own form. To be a canvasser, you've got to fill in a thing, and I've got to sign a piece of paper, so there's a bit of a process involved. But that's why we're planning it in such a long time in advance. And no one else who's tried a referendum has ever tried it with this kind of system before, of putting in basically a year of advanced effort and building to get to that point. And it's just purely to build the infrastructure that we need across the province. And so that's what we're trying to do here in British Columbia, to how we can change the laws, how you can join us in the Sensible BC campaign. And I'll just conclude with this, and that's I've got a daughter who's just turned 15. Some of you here might have kids of your own, others might hopefully have children one day. And you know, when I think back to the 70s, when I was just a little kid and everyone thought these laws were going to change, and how much harm and misery has come about over these last 30, 40 years because of cannabis prohibition, not just in Canada, but all around the world, and the many hundreds of thousands of people across Canada that have been charged and convicted, and the great harms that this causes in our society. And I think about my daughter, and I like to imagine a future one day with her children, that they can grow up in a society that never knows cannabis prohibition. And I like to imagine, and I hope you can imagine this with me, that you're an older person, you're a senior citizen, and your grandchildren's there getting ready to go to school, reading their history book, you know, before the school bus comes, doing some studying. And they turn to you and they say, Grandma, Grandpa, I'm reading in my history book here that the cannabis hemp plant used to be illegal when you were younger, and that people would actually go to jail for growing this plant, but I know that my history book's printed on hemp paper, and I know that our house is built out of hemp fiber board, and I know the bus that takes me to school uses hemp fuel to run on, and I know that you use marijuana medicine to treat the aches and pains of being a senior citizen, and I'm pretty sure I had hemp seeds in my breakfast, so what's up with that? How could that have been? And I want you to be able to say, yeah, it's true. People did used to go to jail for growing this plant that's really the world's most wonderful plant. But you know what? I got involved and I made a difference. And I worked hard so that you would never have to know what it's like to live in a society where you get imprisoned or harassed for what herbal medicine you use or for what plant you grow in your garden. And when Sensible BC came to my town, I pledged that I would work hard, and I gathered signatures, and I put in a lot of time and a lot of effort. And when I cast that ballot to legalize marijuana in British Columbia in September of 2014, that was the best vote that I ever cast. And that spread across British Columbia, it spread across Canada, it helped spread around the world, and that is why we have legalized cannabis. That is why you don't ever have to know what it's like to live in a world of cannabis prohibition. We can make that dream happen. Let's not have it be the alternate dream or the ultimate nightmare where we tell our grandkids, yeah, sorry that cannabis is still illegal, sorry that a lot of your friends are in prison for smoking pot and using marijuana medicine because we just didn't get around to it. But maybe you guys can deal with it now in 2030, and maybe we can change the laws at some point. Let's make it happen now. We're so close to making it happen in British Columbia. It's such a very unique time right now with such broad consensus, with all the cities and towns coming on board to vote to change the laws, with political people from both sides of the spectrum coming on board, with Washington and Colorado vote to change the laws. But all that can all slip away, and I can easily envision a future where all these gains are lost, and where Obama cracks down, where Harper cracks down, we lose what we've built. It's happened before and it can happen again. But I believe we can change this. And I don't believe that naively or innocently. It's going to take a lot of work and a lot of effort. But I think that this is an issue whose time has come. And if you're here today, it's because you share that dream with me. So let's make that dream come true. Let's change these laws here in British Columbia. We can do it together. Thank you very much for being here. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about the campaign. Thank you very much.